The lightweight division in the UFC is the most stacked division, hands down. But for some reason, we can't get any of these contenders booked up in fights. There seems to be a bit of a holdup in the lightweight division right now, and nobody's getting booked. So I've taken things into my own hand, and today I'm going to be matchmaking the lightweight division. Now, I don't think this is what the UFC is going to do necessarily, but I think this is what they should do. It really isn't that hard. So starting off at the top of the division, Islam Makhachev needs an opponent. And I think that should be Ilia Topuria. I don't think that's too crazy to say. I think a lot of people think that this should be the fight that's made next. But also people are saying that Ilia hasn't done enough to warrant a fight with Makhachev, which I think is so far from the truth. But I don't want to harp on that too much. I've talked about it a lot. But I think honestly, Ilia versus Islam, it's the fight to make. It's two guys at the peak of their powers. Ilia is riding a high right now that you may not see again in his career, beating Volk, beating Max. I think it warrants himself a title shot at 155. And for Islam, there's not a ton of other guys that make sense right now, and Ilia is the one guy that actually does. This fight has to happen. I hope the UFC doesn't do anything crazy, like put Justin Gaethje in a title shot versus Islam or somebody else. None of it makes sense. The only other guy that does make sense is Arman Tsarukyan, but the UFC has already said he's not getting the next shot. So, if it's not him, I think it has to be Ilia. There's a lot of rumors coming out right now saying that Ilia won't be next for the title, which I think is a massive mistake, and he's going to have to fight somebody else. But this is what I think should happen, and what I think should happen is Islam versus Ilia. Arman Tsarukyan, of course, I mentioned before, and he needs a matchup. I think you got to rebook the Charles Oliveira fight. Charles Oliveira, Arman Tsarukyan 2, a #1 contenders fight. I think that's what makes the most sense. Listen, Charles Oliveira, of course, he did lose a close decision to Arman Tsarukyan, but since then, he picked up a win over Michael Chandler. So he went out, he got that win, and now he's put himself back into that title conversation. And Arman needs a top contender to fight, so I think Charles makes the most sense. Their first fight was really close. If you do this one 5 rounds this time, like a lot of people want, I think that we can get a definitive answer, and the winner of that can go on and face the winner of Islam versus Ilia. So those two fights are pretty easy to put together. I think those are the most logical answers, but when you go through the rest of the lightweight division, that's when things get a little more interesting, especially with Dustin Poirier's next matchup, because you have to be careful with this one. This is his retirement fight. You want to give him a real good chance at winning, but you don't want to give him an absolute can either. So I think what the best thing to do for Dustin Poirier is, there's two options. There's the Justin Gaethje trilogy, which would make sense because it's 1-1, and it could be a nice way to see Dustin go out, and it's a fight he could definitely win. I haven't gone with that though. I've gone with another fight with Max Holloway. And yes, technically Dustin Poirier has beaten Max Holloway twice. Why on earth would there be a trilogy? But those wins were a while back, and this is a completely different version of both fighters. Max is coming up to lightweight permanently now, and yeah, he did lose to Ilia and got knocked out, but before that, he knocked out Justin Gaethje, so it showed that he can still hang with the 155ers. Plus, Max also holds the BMF title, and if you put on a fight in Louisiana, Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway for the BMF belt, I mean, that writes itself. That's perfect. Imagine Dustin winning that fight and taking the BMF belt with him on his way out of the sport. I mean, it would be perfect. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's a guy that Dustin can beat. It's a guy he has history with, and it's a fight you could still promote and still get people behind because it's two fan favorites, and you know they're going to go to war. So where does that leave us with Justin Gaethje, who I just mentioned? A guy who I don't think is close to a title shot, but it seems like the UFC thinks he's a lot closer than I do. They are considering throwing him in a title fight with Islam Makhachev, which just doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons. I think Justin needs at least 1 or 2 more wins to even be considered for a belt again, and that's why I've decided to match him up with the winner of Paddy Pimblett versus Michael Chandler. Paddy versus Mike is an interesting fight, and it's a fight where I don't know who's going to win. If I had to pick, I'd probably say Chandler. So yeah, you'd have to see Gaethje and Chandler again, but is anybody really going to complain about that? I mean, their first fight was awesome. I wouldn't mind seeing that again. And if Paddy wins, there's Paddy into the top 5 against a proven contender, a big name, and that could be another win he can get under his belt. If he goes and beats Chandler and then goes and beats Gaethje, then Paddy could really be considered for a title. And on Justin Gaethje's side, he went out and beat Fiziev, and then he beat an up-and-comer in Paddy Pimblett or a guy like Michael Chandler, and there you go. That's 2 wins, and then you can start talking about potentially going back into a title shot. So Gaethje versus the winner of Paddy or Mike, I think that's the best thing they can do for him at this point. Of course, there's also Dan Hooker as well, who was scheduled to face Justin Gaethje, and honestly, I wouldn't even be too pissed if they decided to rebook that fight. I think that makes sense as well, but I've gone with something different. I've gone with Dan Hooker actually welcoming somebody into the top 10, and that somebody is Maurizio Ruffy. Now, I know Ruffy called out Beneil Dariush, and that fight could definitely happen, but I think this one makes a little more sense. I mean, Dan Hooker, he's a dog. He's been on a tear, and yeah, maybe you could say that Hooker shouldn't be looking back in the rankings, and he should be looking up, and maybe inviting a guy like Maurizio Ruffy, who's super dangerous and super low down in the division, it wouldn't be the best idea for Dan Hooker. But I mean, think about that fight on paper. Ruffy versus Dan Hooker. You have a guy in Ruffy who's one of the craftiest strikers we've seen in a very long time against a guy like Dan Hooker who can take a beating. I'm not sure Ruffy would be able to get past a guy like Dan just because of how durable he is, and we've seen Ruffy fade as the fight goes on. I think it's a super compelling matchup, and yeah, it doesn't make a ton of sense from Dan Hooker's perspective, but if you line up the division like I just did, Dan Hooker's in a weird spot to where you don't necessarily know who should be his next opponent. So I think, honestly, I think Ruffy versus Dan Hooker, I think it's great. It welcomes Ruffy to the division. It gives him a true test. And yeah, Dan could fully win that fight and completely shut down the Ruffy hype train, but when you get these guys into the top 10, you got to start taking those risks with these prospects. You got to test them, and you got to see if they can actually hang with the best. So where does that leave Beneil Dariush? Well, I've decided to pin him up against Renato Moicano, another fight that was already booked. And you could honestly intertwine these with the Hooker and Ruffy fight. You could kind of do Hooker versus Moicano because they have a little beef, and then you can go Ruffy and Beneil Dariush. I think that works perfectly. You could do that as well, but I've decided to go Moicano Dariush just because I think Moicano deserves to have this fight against Dariush, and I think because he took that fight against Islam on short notice, I think he's deserving of this. He deserves to have this fight, to have his chance at Beneil Dariush, and it could get him back in the win column. And for Beneil Dariush, it's a winnable fight for him as well. You don't want to pin Beneil against a guy like Ruffy. I know Beneil's on his way out, but I mean, come on. Is anybody going to pick Beneil Dariush to beat Maurizio Ruffy at this point? Probably not. Would you pick him to beat Renato Moicano, though? Maybe. It's a much more competitive fight, and it's much more compelling, and I think this is a fight that we could honestly see if the UFC decides to go down this route pretty soon. I think Moicano's ready for another fight, but Neil's obviously ready, so why not just rebook these guys and throw them on a pay-per-view in the summer? And there you have it. That's how I would matchmake the lightweight division. It really isn't that hard. I mean, I did pretty much a lot of basic matchups that I think a lot of people would expect if they were in the matchmaking position. And I think the UFC should just do it. I mean, we need to get fights booked. Like right now, the UFC is pretty dry. There's not a lot of exciting fights coming up, and we need to inject some life into the sport again, and this is a division to do so. So many fun fights. Ilya Islam, Charles Arman, Poirier Max, Justin Gaethje, Dan Hooker. There's so many dudes that need fights booked, and it needs to be done soon. Let me know if you guys agree with me, though. Let me know if you guys agree with my matchmaking in the comments down below. Thank you all for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you all in the next one.